The stage was now fully set. Buda had fallen, the dominoes toppled, and the fate of Central Europe narrowed onto a single point, the walls of Vienna, and the clash that would soon shake them. The final days of September 1529 brought with them the sight that Vienna had both dreaded and prepared for. Dust rose on the horizon, carried by the wind in great brown clouds that thickened with each passing hour. From the watchtowers, men squinted against the low autumn sun and saw the glint of armor, the shimmer of spear points, and the faint outlines of banners snapping in the breeze. The scouts had been right. The storm had arrived. Suleiman's army was no longer a rumor, no longer a distant thunder on the plains. It was here, and it stretched so far that the eye could not find its end. For the defenders on the walls, the moment of truth was almost unbearable. Behind them lay their families, their homes, their city. Before them spread the greatest military force on earth. The numbers alone told the story. 20,000 men within Vienna, facing 5 times that number outside. Each soldier on the battlements knew that for every comrade by his side, 5 enemies waited below. To gaze upon that sea of humanity was to look at the very embodiment of impossible odds. Yet still they gripped their pikes, shouldered their arquebuses, and stood their ground, because there was no longer any other choice. As the Ottoman host uncoiled across the plain, it transformed the land itself. Fields and meadows that had grown quiet during weeks of anticipation now became the foundation for a temporary city of war. Tents rose in endless rows, some vast enough to house whole companies, others small but numerous, covering the earth like a carpet. The Sultan's pavilion, draped in silks and guarded by elite janissaries, became the nucleus of this sprawling encampment. From it radiated streets, markets, smithies, stables, and kitchens. In a single day, Suleiman had conjured a metropolis that rivaled Vienna itself, a city of soldiers, horses, and war machines. The first task of the Ottomans was reconnaissance. Engineers and officers rode the perimeter, measuring distances, mapping the walls, and identifying weaknesses. Their keen eyes studied every tower, every gate, every slope of earth that might conceal a battery of cannon. Siege specialists debated the angles of fire, the placement of trenches, and the lines along which to drive tunnels. To them, Vienna was not a city of living souls, but a fortress to be unmade, a puzzle to be dismantled stone by stone. Within the walls, the defenders watched this silent preparation with dread. They saw men pacing the ground with rods, measuring distances. They saw earthworks begin to rise, trenches dug in neat lines like the furrows of a farmer's field, only these were not for crops, but for death. At night, campfires stretched across the horizon in such numbers that it seemed as though the earth itself had caught fire. The light reflected on the clouds, turning the sky red, as if announcing the coming of judgment. The psychological impact was crushing. Soldiers who had held bravely during the weeks of preparation now felt the weight of numbers pressing down on them. How could 20,000 resist when confronted with such an ocean of humanity? Some whispered prayers, others gritted their teeth, a few stared blankly, lost in despair. Yet the commanders understood that fear, if unchecked, could destroy the defense before the first shot was fired. Count Salm and Roggendorf walked the battlements, speaking to men directly, urging calm, reminding them that walls and courage could hold against numbers. Whether the soldiers believed those words or not mattered less than the fact that they heard them, spoken with conviction in the face of terror. The Ottomans wasted no time stripping Vienna's suburbs of life and cover. Outlying villages, cottages, and farmsteads were torched, their wooden beams collapsing in waves of smoke and sparks. Orchards and vineyards were torn down, denying defenders both shelter and supplies. Even the churches outside the walls were pulled apart, their stones repurposed for Ottoman earthworks. By the time the fires died, nothing but blackened ruins surrounded Vienna. For the defenders on the walls, the sight was a cruel omen. They knew that everything they loved beyond the gates was already lost. When the first exchanges of fire began, the sound shook both earth and heart. Ottoman artillery, though weakened by the mud of the march, still roared with thunder. Cannonballs slammed into Vienna's walls, hurling stone fragments like shrapnel. Arquebuses cracked from trenches, their smoke curling into the cold air. The defenders responded in kind, firing from embrasures, loosing arrows, and hurling stones down upon the nearest attackers. The air filled with smoke, the acrid smell of powder, the cries of men struck down in the first clashes of what promised to be a brutal contest. Standing on the walls during those first days was an experience carved into memory. The ground trembled with every cannon blast. The sky seemed always veiled in smoke, pierced only by the streak of fire from a burning house or the glint of sunlight on steel. Men clutched their weapons, knowing that a moment's hesitation could mean death. Yet the most haunting part was the silence between volleys. In those heartbeats, when no gun fired and no stone fell, the defenders heard the faint murmur of the Ottoman camp, the distant beating of drums, the neigh of horses, the foreign voices of tens of thousands waiting for the next command. The walls themselves became both shield and prison. From atop them, the defenders looked out on the plain and saw the immensity of the force arrayed against them. Behind those same walls, civilians huddled in fear, their lives dependent on the courage of soldiers and the strength of stone. Mothers quieted children with whispered prayers. Merchants locked their shops, knowing gold would mean nothing if the city fell. Every man, woman, and child felt the weight of the siege settling over them like a suffocating cloak. For the Ottomans, this was the beginning of triumph. Their trenches crept closer with each passing day, their artillery continued its relentless pounding, and their confidence remained unshaken. Suleiman himself surveyed the walls from horseback, surrounded by attendants and guards, certain that time was on his side. Vienna had been encircled, the gates of destiny had closed. Rain came as though summoned by the prayers of the city. At first it was a drizzle, a fine mist that dampened cloaks and softened the earth. But within days it became a torrent, relentless, cold, and merciless. Sheets of water lashed across the Ottoman camp, turning tents into sodden caves, trenches into rivers, and roads into swamps. The very ground seemed to rebel against Suleiman's will. For the first time since the march from Istanbul, the unstoppable war machine began to falter. The roads bore the brunt of this natural assault. Where once they had carried caravans of grain, powder, and cannon, they now dissolved into endless stretches of mud. Horses sank to their knees, oxen strained until their yokes snapped, and carts tipped sideways, swallowed by the mire. Men waded ankle-deep, then knee-deep, in brown muck that clung to every step. What had been a highway of conquest became an ocean of sludge. The army that had seemed like a tide of iron was reduced to a struggling mass, every mile costing precious energy and time. The heaviest toll fell on the great cannons. These colossal engines of destruction, masterpieces of Ottoman metallurgy, had been dragged across Hungary at unimaginable effort. Now they were betrayed by the earth itself. Wheels that once turned slowly now refused to move at all, mired in ruts as deep as graves. Soldiers lashed teams of animals to the gun carriages, shouting, cursing, whipping, but the mud would not yield. In the end, dozens of cannons, the very weapons meant to smash Vienna's walls, were abandoned. They lay half buried in the Hungarian countryside, monuments to the futility of human ambition before the will of nature. Without their heaviest, right now, as you watch this in comfort, imagine standing behind crumbling medieval walls, watching an army of 100,000 Ottoman warriors approach like a dark tide. The air is cold, smoke already drifts from fires in the suburbs, and the ground trembles beneath the march of a force so vast that it seems less like men and horses and more like an earthquake spilling across the land. You grip the wooden stock of a pike, knuckles white, and wonder how long the walls will hold. Behind you are your family, your neighbors, your entire city. 20,000 souls who know that if the gates fall, their world ends. In front of you stretches a sea of spears, banners, and cannons, commanded by the most powerful man in the known world, Suleiman the Magnificent. Welcome to the sleepless wars. Wherever you're watching from, whether it's a quiet corner late at night in Berlin, a busy morning in New York, or somewhere far away from Vienna's ancient stones, I'm glad you're here. History, after all, is not just a series of dates in dusty books. It is the beating heart of choices, fears, courage, and desperate gambles that shape the world you live in right now. So thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most dramatic sieges in European history. Before we dive fully into the fire and smoke of 1529, a small request. If you enjoy military history told in a way that keeps you awake, sometimes even long into the night, please consider subscribing. It helps this channel grow, and I'm grateful for every person who decides to walk with me into these long shadows of the past. Just be warned, the stories we tell here, once they start, are hard to put down. Like the defenders of Vienna, you may find yourself staying awake far longer than you expected. So let us set the stage. The year is 1529. The Renaissance is in full swing, but Europe is also deeply fractured. The Reformation has torn Christianity into bitter camps, and the Habsburg Emperor Charles V struggles to hold together a realm stretched from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. Yet the greatest threat does not come from internal squabbles or rebellious princes. It comes from the East. The Ottoman Empire, a juggernaut that had conquered Constantinople less than a century before, now stretches across 3 continents. At its head stands Suleiman, a man only 35 years old, already celebrated as both a conqueror and a lawgiver, but above all as the undisputed master of the most formidable military machine on earth. Against him lies Vienna, not the splendid Baroque capital that would one day emerge, but a city of medieval walls, thick in some places, crumbling in others, encircled by narrow streets and towers that had not been designed to resist the thunder of Ottoman artillery. Its defenders number barely 20,000. Soldiers, townsfolk, mercenaries, and noble commanders who know they are not just outnumbered, but outclassed. the ratio is absurd. 5 Ottoman soldiers for every defender. From the perspective of pure numbers, Vienna should fall in days. Yet Vienna holds something beyond stone. It holds a position of staggering importance. Perched on the Danube, it is the gateway into the very heart of Europe. If Vienna falls, the Ottoman armies can roll into Central Europe, threatening not just Austria, but the very balance of Christendom itself. The stakes are immense, and everyone at the time knows it. As one contemporary chronicler put it, if Vienna falls, the way to Rome and the empire is open. Picture this tension like a massive chessboard, where one player commands an overwhelming array of queens and rooks, while the other clutches only a few pawns, a battered knight, and the fragile king. Yet this game is not abstract. It is flesh, blood, and fire. This is not just about one city. This is the battle that decided whether Europe would remain Christian or become part of the Ottoman Empire. Imagine standing in that moment. The citizens of Vienna know they are staring into the abyss. Refugees have poured in, telling tales of villages burned, fortresses leveled, entire regions flattened beneath the march of Suleiman's army. The defenders must cling to walls built in the 13th century, walls that were never meant to withstand gunpowder artillery, let alone the sledgehammer of Ottoman siege cannons. The people gather what weapons they can, board up homes, store food, and prepare for annihilation. To them, survival feels almost impossible, yet survival is the only option. This is where our story begins, a confrontation between the mightiest empire of the early modern world and a single city perched at the edge of collapse. The impossible odds are so lopsided that in hindsight it seems absurd to even call it a contest. But history, like war, is never predictable. Small decisions, weather, chance, and the grit of human endurance can change the fate of continents. We are going to follow this siege, step by step, through the marches, the storms, the tunnels dug under the earth, and the walls that groaned but did not crumble. We will walk alongside Count Nicholas Salm, an old soldier whose leadership would become legendary, and we will peer into the tent of Suleiman, who believed that nothing could stand before his armies. We will see how a city of merchants, students, and farmers transformed into a fortress of last hope. But before any of this unfolds, picture again the opening moment. Late September 1529. You stand on Vienna's walls, looking out across the horizon. Dust rises in a vast cloud. Drums echo like thunder, banners embroidered with crescents ripple in the wind. Tens of thousands of soldiers are assembling camps so vast they resemble a city made of tents. From your vantage point, the line of men seems endless. The fear in your stomach is real, and the air itself feels charged, as if the entire continent holds its breath. This is the impossible stage, set for the drama to come. The horizon thickens with banners and the echo of drums. But to understand why this storm has come, we must step back from Vienna's trembling walls and follow the shadow that cast itself across Europe long before September of 1529. That shadow belongs to Suleiman, the man his people called Kanuni, the lawgiver, and whom the world remembers as Suleiman the Magnificent. He was born in 1494 in Trabzon on the Black Sea, the son of Sultan Selim II, a ruler known for his ruthless expansion and the crushing defeat of the Mamluk Sultanate. From an early age, Suleiman's destiny was entwined with conquest, By the time he inherited the throne in 1520, he was only 26, yet he commanded an empire that stretched farther than any European kingdom could dream. Istanbul, once Constantinople, had become the jewel of the world, its domes and minarets rising above the Bosphorus, its palaces brimming with wealth, its armies disciplined, professional, and terrifyingly effective. Under Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire did not simply exist. It surged like a tidal force. He had already conquered Belgrade in 1521, tearing open the gates of Central Europe. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, he smashed the Hungarian kingdom in a single afternoon, leaving tens of thousands dead in the mud of the Danube plain. The King of Hungary himself was among the slain, his crown lost, his realm shattered. For Europe, the victory at Mohacs was not just another Ottoman triumph. It was an earthquake. The medieval kingdom that had served as a buffer between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs had been obliterated, and the road northward now stood open. Suleiman was not content with victories alone. He ruled like a monarch from legend, a man whose court poets compared him to Alexander, whose legal reforms reshaped the empire, and whose armies seemed unstoppable. The Ottomans at this moment in history were not a wandering host or a fragile dynasty. They were the greatest war machine the early modern world had yet seen. Its janissaries were the elite, drilled from childhood to fight with absolute loyalty. Its cavalry swept across plains like lightning. Its artillery train was so vast that European observers marveled not only at its size, but at the precision with which it was deployed. The empire itself was like a massive engine, grinding inexorably forward, fueled by tribute, trade, and conquest. Against this storm stood Vienna. The city may have looked provincial compared to Istanbul or Rome, but its position was everything. Nestled on the Danube, it controlled the key routes that threaded into the heart of Central Europe. Whoever held Vienna could project power into the German states, into Bohemia, even toward Italy. In the eyes of Suleiman, Vienna was not just another fortress, it was the gateway to the West. On the other side of this looming confrontation stood Charles V, the Habsburg Emperor, and perhaps the only ruler whose domains could rival the Ottoman sultans. Charles ruled Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, much of Italy, and lands across the Atlantic newly claimed for Christendom. Yet his empire was a patchwork, riven by rebellion, debt, and the firestorm of the Protestant Reformation. German princes defied him. His wars against France drained his coffers. His fleets fought to defend the Mediterranean from Ottoman corsairs. For Charles, Vienna was both a prize and a burden. He could not afford to lose it, yet he had little capacity to reinforce it. His brother Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, had to make do with what he could muster. Those 20,000 defenders who would soon find themselves staring down Suleiman's host. The rivalry between Habsburg and Ottoman was not merely political, it was civilizational. The Ottomans had inherited the mantle of Rome in the east, their sultans calling themselves Caesars, their empire ruling over Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, wrapped themselves in the claim of defending Christendom, the Holy Roman Emperors of a fractured and quarrelsome Germany. Vienna became the fault line where these two colossal worlds collided. For Suleiman, the decision to march west in 1529 was more than ambition, it was strategy. After Mohacs, he had placed a pliable vassal on the Hungarian throne, but Habsburg forces under Ferdinand challenged this control. The Hungarians were divided, their fortresses falling one by one, and Vienna stood as the keystone that could either hold back the Ottomans or collapse, opening all of Central Europe. To Suleiman, the logic was simple: strike at Vienna, crush it, and the heart of Europe would lie exposed. Picture the empire he commanded, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Adriatic, from the Black Sea to the Nile. His rule extended over tens of millions. Taxes from trade flowing through Istanbul filled his treasuries. His court architects raised monuments that seemed to scrape the heavens. His navy prowled the Mediterranean, enslaving thousands, striking terror into coasts as far away as Spain and Italy. He was not merely a monarch, he was a force of nature. Europeans of the time spoke of the Ottomans as if they were a storm, a relentless tempest that advanced season after season. One chronicler described them as a rolling thunder, never resting, never ceasing, grinding forward until all before it is shattered. The metaphor is apt. The Ottoman army of Suleiman was like an immense machine, powered by wealth and discipline, fueled by belief in both faith and empire. Against such a machine, Vienna seemed like nothing more than a rock in a river's path, doomed to be worn away. To understand how Europe reached this moment, one must look back to the arc of Ottoman expansion. A century earlier, the walls of Constantinople had crumbled under the great cannon of Mehmed II. From that victory flowed a river of conquests: Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Greece, much of Hungary. The Ottomans did not merely capture lands, they reorganized them, absorbed them, and set them to fuel the empire's next advance. Each fortress captured became a supply base. Each conquered people became either soldiers or taxpayers. It was a methodical, grinding expansion. By 1529, there was no serious doubt. Unless checked, the Ottomans would continue to push westward until nothing stood in their path. The Habsburgs, by contrast, were stretched thin. Charles Vere's wars with France consumed armies and gold. The revolt of Luther's followers tore apart the religious fabric of Germany. Even as Suleiman gathered his armies, Charles had to divide his attention between defending Catholicism, managing revolts, and holding together an empire that spanned oceans. To Suleiman, this weakness was an opportunity. Strike hard, strike fast, and Vienna would fall before Charles could rally his divided lords. So, in the spring of 1529, the decision was made. Suleiman summoned his armies, ordered the great cannon trains to be prepared, and directed his gaze westward. The empire shifted like a massive beast awakening from slumber. Garrisons were called up, supplies gathered, tens of thousands of men marshaled beneath the Sultan's banners. It was not merely an army on the march, it was an empire in motion. The march toward Vienna would test this war machine in ways few expected. Yet at the moment of decision, as Suleiman prepared to lead his host across the Balkans, there was little doubt in his mind. The empire had crushed Belgrade. The empire had crushed Mohacs. The empire would crush Vienna. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, the great engine of conquest roaring to life as it rolled inexorably toward the heart of Europe. The great engine of conquest roared to life, and in the spring of 1529 it began to move. From the heart of the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman gathered an army the world had rarely seen in such numbers. Contemporary estimates range wildly, some claiming more than 200,000, but sober modern scholarship, sifting through Ottoman records and logistical accounts, places the figure at around 120,000 men. Even at the lower count, it was colossal. Picture the composition. At its core stood the Janissaries, perhaps 12 to 15,000 strong, the Sultan's household infantry. disciplined to a level unmatched in Europe. Clad in distinctive uniforms, armed with matchlock muskets, pikes, and scimitars, they were the blade of Suleiman's will. Around them swirled the Sipahis, the Ottoman cavalry drawn from provincial fiefholders, their lances glittering, their horses restless with energy. Behind them marched auxiliaries, levied troops from across the empire, each carrying the traditions and weapons of their homelands: Albanians, Bosnians, Anatolians, Arabs. Artillerymen guarded the massive bronze cannons, weapons so heavy that entire teams of oxen strained just to drag them forward. Engineers, sappers, blacksmiths, cooks, clerks, and physicians filled the ranks. This was not a single army. It was an entire moving world. Imagine what it meant to assemble such a host. Supplying 120,000 men required staggering quantities of grain, livestock, salt, and water. Thousands of animals had to be brought along: horses, oxen, camels, each of which needed its own fodder. The army carried supplies, but no wagon train could hold enough to sustain them for months. The Ottomans relied on an intricate system of supply depots, river transport, and forced requisition from the lands they marched through. Every village and town in their path knew the weight of this burden. For the empire, it was an organized process. For the locals, it was devastation. Modern archaeologists have traced parts of this march route through the Balkans, uncovering remnants of encampments, discarded weapon fragments, and telltale layers of ash where temporary fires once burned. The scale boggles the imagination. To move this army was like relocating an entire city every single day. Roads churned into mud under the weight of oxen carts. Bridges strained beneath the pounding hooves of cavalry. Fields were stripped bare to feed the marching columns. Wherever the Ottomans passed, the land itself seemed consumed. Psychological warfare played its own role. As banners appeared on the horizon, green standards embroidered with verses, scarlet pennants of cavalry regiments, the gilded emblems of the Janissaries, towns often surrendered without resistance. The memory of Mohat lingered too fresh. Whole garrisons abandoned their posts, unwilling to face the machine that had crushed Hungary's army in a single day. To many villages, opening their gates and submitting was preferable to annihilation. Each surrender added to the sense of inevitability, that nothing could halt Suleiman's advance. Yet the march was not without its strains. Nature, indifferent to empire or glory, began to show her hand early. Heavy spring rains turned Balkan roads into quagmires. Wagons bogged down axle deep. Horses sank into sucking mud. Progress slowed to a crawl, straining the carefully calculated timetables. The vast artillery pieces, some weighing more than a ton, became dead weight, dragged forward only by immense effort. Even then, many had to be abandoned, swallowed by the mud of Hungary before they ever reached Vienna. Contemporary accounts speak of fields left littered with broken wheels, discarded equipment, and carcasses of animals that collapsed from exhaustion. The great war machine was powerful, but its size made it vulnerable. Moving such a colossal host required precision, and any disruption, whether disease or hunger, multiplied into catastrophe. The empire had assembled an unstoppable tide, yet each day it pushed forward cost more men, more animals, more supplies. Still, the sight of it terrified Europe. Reports traveled faster than the army itself. Messengers galloped into Vienna with news that the Sultan's host had crossed the Danube. Letters circulated through the Habsburg court describing columns of men stretching farther than the eye could see. The sheer numbers became legend before the soldiers even arrived. For the Viennese, each rumor was a hammer blow of dread. They knew that if the Ottomans advanced unchecked, they would soon be the ones staring down this endless column of banners and drums. The logistics nightmare was more than movement. Feeding the army was a constant crisis. Each man required at least a pound of grain per day. That meant over 100,000 pounds daily, plus forage for tens of thousands of animals. Ottoman quartermasters were skilled, but no calculation could entirely prevent shortages. Soldiers pillaged fields, took grain stores, and consumed livestock. Towns stripped by this passing tide resembled husks, their people left with nothing. Yet the machine moved on, grinding inexorably forward, powered by hunger as much as by steel. To the defenders of Vienna, news of this advance arrived like thunder before a storm. They heard of villages flattened, fortresses abandoned, nobles fleeing westward. They heard of banners blotting the horizon, of a sultan traveling in regal splendor at the head of his army. Suleiman himself traveled not as a harried commander, but as an emperor on procession, his pavilion adorned with silk, his guards gleaming, his authority unquestioned. The march was war, but it was also theater, an assertion of power so overwhelming that resistance seemed folly. Yet, as mighty as it appeared, cracks were already forming. Rain fell, mud deepened, wheels broke, oxen died. Disease whispered at the edges of the camp. Dysentery began to spread in the damp conditions. Still the host pressed on, driven by Suleiman's command, unwilling to show weakness before Europe. Each hardship endured only added to the legend of inevitability, for the army continued to advance despite all obstacles. One must imagine the perspective of a villager watching this procession pass. Dawn would bring the first columns of cavalry, dust rising behind them. By noon, janissaries marched in perfect ranks, their matchlocks gleaming. Afternoon brought the artillery train, rumbling like thunder. Nightfall still saw wagons, servants, camp followers, and herds of livestock shuffling forward. The army was not just soldiers, it was cooks, blacksmiths, merchants, women, children, slaves, an entire society on the move. Watching it pass must have felt like witnessing the migration of nations, unstoppable, unending, beyond comprehension. To Vienna, these reports carried a single message. The storm was coming. The storm was coming, and Vienna stood waiting, a city that seemed far too fragile to hold the weight of an empire's fate. At first glance in 1529, it did not look like a fortress destined for legend. Nestled on the Danube, Vienna was more a trading hub than a war citadel. Its streets bustled with merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. Its skyline was dominated by the soaring spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral rather than massive walls. Yet geography gave it a strategic weight beyond its appearance. The Danube was Europe's central highway, linking east to west, and Vienna sat at a choke point. Whoever controlled it could push into Germany, threaten Bohemia, and even open paths into Italy. Vienna was not just another city, it was the hinge on which the future of Central Europe turned. The problem was that its defences belonged to an earlier age. The walls encircling Vienna had been built in the 13th century. They were high, of stone and mortar, formidable in their day, but siege warfare had changed. The age of towering medieval walls was over. Gunpowder artillery had rewritten the rules. Cannons could reduce tall, thin walls to rubble in days. The new ideal was the Tres Italienne, angular bastions of earth and stone designed to deflect cannonballs and allow interlocking fields of fire. Vienna, by contrast, had neither the time nor the money to reinvent its defenses in this modern style. Its walls were relics, tall but brittle, designed for ladders and catapults, not for bronze cannons thundering from Ottoman batteries. Inside the city, the responsibility for its defense fell to two men. The first was Count Nicholas Graf Salm, a veteran soldier already 70 years old, his body weathered by decades of campaigning. He was not the fiery young general one might imagine leading such a desperate stand. Instead, he was calm, deliberate, and deeply experienced. His career had carried him across the patchwork wars of Europe, fighting the French in Italy, skirmishing with rebellious nobles, enduring the grind of long campaigns. Now, near the end of his life, he faced a task that would test every ounce of his judgment, holding Vienna against the greatest army in the world. Salm was not a man of grand speeches. Accounts describe him as pragmatic, focused, sometimes severe, but always steady. In many ways, he was the opposite of Suleiman, who embodied splendor and imperial magnificence. Salm embodied resilience, the stubbornness of an old soldier who had seen too many battles to be intimidated by numbers alone. His very age became a symbol. Here was a man who had no illusions, who understood war's cruelty, and yet who stood ready to face it once more. At his side was Wilhelm von Roggendorf, another seasoned commander. Roggendorf had fought in Italy as well, and brought with him a sharp sense of tactics and the bitter lessons of modern warfare. Together, Salm and Roggendorf became the unlikely duo who would shape Vienna's defense. One the elder statesman of the battlefield, the other the practical organizer, ensuring that every available resource was put to use. The garrison they commanded numbered only about 20,000. It was a patchwork force. There were professional soldiers, Spanish and German mercenaries hardened in Italy. There were local militia, craftsmen and townsmen pressed into service. There were nobles with their retainers, cavalry from the surrounding regions, and even students, farmers and clerks willing to take up arms. The odds were impossible. One defender for every 5 attackers, perhaps worse if the Ottomans' numbers swelled. Yet Salm and Roggendorf knew that morale mattered as much as mathematics. They organized the defenders into companies, assigned posts along the walls, and drilled them in the routines of watch, fire, and counter-attack. The preparations spread beyond the soldiers. Civilians became part of the defense, willingly or not. Blacksmiths worked around the clock to repair weapons. Women and children carried stones, water, and supplies to the ramparts. Food was rationed, wells secured, and shelters dug. Houses outside the walls were burned, leaving nothing for the approaching enemy to use as cover. Refugees from Hungary poured into the city, swelling its population and bringing grim tales of the Ottoman advance. Their stories only heightened the sense of dread. Everyone knew what had happened at Mohacs. Everyone knew that Vienna stood on the edge of annihilation. Archaeological discoveries in Vienna in recent years have shed light on what those fortifications really looked like in 1529. Excavations have revealed fragments of the old medieval walls, foundations of towers, and traces of the ditches that ringed the city. Scholars studying these remains note just how inadequate they were against modern siege artillery. The walls were high but relatively thin compared to the massive earthworks then being built in Italy or the Low Countries. They lacked angled bastions. Their towers were vulnerable to concentrated cannon fire. To look at them with modern eyes is to wonder how they stood at all against Suleiman's artillery. Yet sometimes weakness forces ingenuity, and Salm and Roggendorf would exploit every advantage the old walls still offered. The defenders reinforced what they could. Earth was piled against the inner faces of the walls to absorb cannon impact. Wooden palisades were hastily raised in weak points. Ditches were deepened and sharpened stakes planted. Streets inside the city were barricaded, prepared for house-to-house fighting if the walls fell. It was the transformation of a city into a fortress, not by design, but by desperation. Every stone became a weapon, every hand a tool for survival. Meanwhile, life inside the city shifted into the rhythm of siege preparation. Markets still opened, though food grew scarcer. The bells of St. Stephen's rang, sometimes to call to prayer, sometimes to summon workers to the walls. Fear pressed on the people, yet there was also a grim determination. This was not merely about survival, but about defiance. They knew that if Vienna fell, the consequences would spread far beyond their homes. Imagine walking through those narrow streets in September 1529. Everywhere you would hear the hammering of nails, the rasp of saws, the rumble of carts bringing stones to the walls. You would see students with pikes on their shoulders, women hauling water buckets, priests moving among the people offering blessings. The city had become a garrison, every alley a potential battleground. Children, too young to fight, gathered stones to be hurled from the walls. No one was untouched. The preparations carried a ritual quality. Defenders painted crosses on their shields, prayed before icons, and swore oaths to hold the walls. The knowledge that they faced impossible odds gave their actions a strange clarity. There would be no retreat, there could be no retreat. For Vienna, it was victory or annihilation. Beyond the walls, the Danube flowed, as it always had, indifferent to human struggle. Yet even the river became part of the defense, its bridges fortified, its currents watched for signs of Ottoman rafts or boats. Scouts rode out daily, returning with news of advancing cavalry. Each report drew the circle of fear tighter. Each hour the city braced itself more firmly for the hammer that was about to fall. In September of 1529, the Ottoman tide rolled westward with relentless momentum, and its first great prize was Buda. Perched along the banks of the Danube, the Hungarian capital had long been a seat of kings, a place of palaces, churches, and political weight. Now it became the latest domino to topple before Suleiman's advancing army. The city was already weakened, fractured by years of turmoil since the disaster at Mohacs 3 years earlier. With King Louis II dead and the Hungarian crown contested, resistance was fractured, authority uncertain, and morale nearly gone. When the banners of the Sultan appeared, the city's fate was already sealed. The fall of Buda was not marked by a single thunderous battle, but by the slow suffocation of inevitability. Ottoman troops, disciplined and overwhelming, advanced with siege engines and cannons, their sheer numbers enough to cow defenders. Few in Hungary still believed they could stand alone against Suleiman. Local nobles argued, militia scattered, and mercenaries weighed their pay against the risks of standing against the greatest army in the known world. The walls of Buda, old and tired like Vienna's, could not inspire confidence. In the end, resistance collapsed and the city yielded. For the Ottomans, it was not a question of if, but when. The capture of Buda carried strategic weight far beyond its crumbling battlements. It was the last great bastion on the road to Vienna. With it in Ottoman hands, the path west lay open. There were no more significant fortresses between Suleiman's army and the Habsburg capital. Every mile of road from Buda to Vienna now became a highway for Ottoman supply lines, a corridor through which cavalry and cannon could flow without resistance. In the chessboard of Europe, Buda's fall tipped the balance heavily in the Sultan's favor. For the Hungarians, it was another chapter in a national tragedy unfolding in real time. The once proud kingdom had been shattered at Mohacs, its nobility decimated, its king drowned in flight, and now its capital humbled. Those who survived fled westward, carrying with them stories that spread terror. Refugees poured across the countryside like scattered leaves before a storm. They told of endless Ottoman ranks stretching to the horizon, of janissaries marching with perfect discipline, of cannons so vast they shook the earth. These tales grew with retelling, becoming larger than life, but their effect was the same: panic. Villages emptied, farmers abandoned their fields, carts laden with families and belongings clogged the roads to Vienna, the refugees arriving breathless with tales of doom. Inside Vienna, the flood of refugees was both a warning and a burden. Each family that entered brought fear, but also mouths to feed. The stories they told unsettled the defenders. Was the Ottoman army truly 100,000 strong? Did they really bring cannons larger than any yet seen in Europe? Could any city resist them? The soldiers on the walls heard these questions whispered in the markets and taverns, and though commanders tried to silence such talk, rumors spread like smoke through the alleys. Yet fear has a strange alchemy. For some it corrodes courage, for others it tempers determination. In Vienna, both reactions took root. Some militiamen considered desertion, slipping out of the gates at night before the enemy closed in. But others found themselves hardened. The thought of Buda's fall, of what it meant to be conquered, stiffened their resolve. Better to die on the walls than to suffer whatever fate awaited under the Sultan's rule. Suleiman, meanwhile, saw only confirmation of his strategy. Everything unfolded according to plan. Mohacs had broken Hungary. Buda's fall proved that Central Europe could not muster a united resistance. Vienna now lay exposed, a jewel waiting to be plucked. The Sultan's confidence was unshaken, his army's morale high. Victories bred certainty, and certainty marched at the head of every Ottoman column. For the Sultan, the conquest of Vienna was not merely a possibility, it was destiny. The mood inside his camp was very different from that within Vienna's walls. Ottoman officers rode with assurance, soldiers marched with songs, and the great cannons trundled forward like engines of inevitability. The Janissaries, elite infantry who were the pride of the empire, drilled daily, their discipline unbroken despite the hardships of the march. In their eyes, each fortress that fell, each town that submitted without a fight, proved that the Sultan's shadow could stretch as far as he willed. Between Buda and Vienna stretched less than 150 miles, a distance that under ordinary conditions could be covered in days. Yet in 1529, those miles became a corridor of fear, every village along the way watching the horizon for Ottoman banners. The weather, always an unpredictable general, began to turn sour. Rain swept across the Danube plain, slowing carts and cannons, but not stopping the march. For Vienna, the delay was a brief mercy. Each day bought by mud and storm was another day for Count Salm and Roggendorf to strengthen their defenses, another day for the city to prepare itself. But mercy came tinged with dread, because the advance, though slowed, did not falter. The domino effect was now in full swing. Mohacs had toppled Hungary. Buda had collapsed with barely a struggle. Each fallen stronghold sent a shudder westward until Vienna stood alone, the final tile still upright on the table. All of Europe watched, breath held, as Suleiman's army closed the gap. Inside the city, preparations reached fever pitch. The walls echoed with the sounds of construction and repair. Watchtowers were manned day and night. Priests led processions through the streets, urging faith and courage. Civilians dug trenches, carried stones, and filled sandbags. The city's defenders understood that there would be no reinforcements in time, no miracle army riding over the hills. Vienna was the shield, and it would either hold or shatter. The psychological weight of Buda's fall hung over them like a shadow. Soldiers imagined the Ottoman cannons now rolling inexorably their way. Refugees spoke of fires that consumed whole neighborhoods, of captives marched away in chains. Whether exaggerated or true, these visions took hold in the minds of the Viennese, painting the future in dark strokes. Yet even as fear gnawed at them, a strange resilience took root. With the enemy so near, choices vanished. There was nowhere left to run. The Danube carried the echoes of both despair and defiance. Barges ferried the last refugees downstream, while upstream supply rafts tried to sneak into the city before the river was sealed by Ottoman patrols. The waterway became both a lifeline and a threat, its currents carrying tidings of war closer with every passing day. On the horizon, scouts brought news of Suleiman's vanguard. Cavalry raiders fanned across the countryside, burning villages, cutting roads, and sowing terror. Yet the main host had not yet arrived. Vienna stood in the tense silence before a storm, every hour of waiting stretching longer, every drumbeat of preparation echoing louder in the hearts of its people. The stage was now fully set. Buda had fallen, the dominoes toppled, and the fate of Central Europe narrowed onto a single point, the walls of Vienna and the clash that would soon shake them. The final days of September 1529 brought with them the sight that Vienna had both dreaded and prepared for. Dust rose on the horizon, carried by the wind in great brown clouds that thickened with each passing hour. From the watchtowers, men squinted against the low autumn sun and saw the glint of armor, the shimmer of spear points, and the faint outlines of banners snapping in the breeze. The scouts had been right. The storm had arrived. Suleiman's army was no longer a rumor, no longer a distant thunder on the plains. It was here, and it stretched so far that the eye could not find its end. For the defenders on the walls, the moment of truth was almost unbearable. Behind them lay their families, their homes, their city. Before them spread the greatest military force on earth. The numbers alone told the story. 20,000 men within Vienna, facing 5 times that number outside. Each soldier on the battlements knew that for every comrade by his side, 5 enemies waited below. To gaze upon that sea of humanity was to look at the very embodiment of impossible odds. Yet still they gripped their pikes, shouldered their arquebuses, and stood their ground, because there was no longer any other choice. As the Ottoman host uncoiled across the plain, it transformed the land itself. Fields and meadows that had grown quiet during weeks of anticipation now became the foundation for a temporary city of war. Tents rose in endless rows, some vast enough to house whole companies, others small but numerous, covering the earth like a carpet. The Sultan's pavilion, draped in silks and guarded by elite janissaries, became the nucleus of this sprawling encampment. From it radiated streets, markets, smithies, stables, and kitchens. In a single day, Suleiman had conjured a metropolis that rivaled Vienna itself, a city of soldiers, horses, and war machines. The first task of the Ottomans was reconnaissance. Engineers and officers rode the perimeter, measuring distances, mapping the walls, and identifying weaknesses. Their keen eyes studied every tower, every gate, every slope of earth that might conceal a battery of cannon. Siege specialists debated the angles of fire, the placement of trenches, and the lines along which to drive tunnels. To them, Vienna was not a city of living souls, but a fortress to be unmade, a puzzle to be dismantled stone by stone. Within the walls, the defenders watched this silent preparation with dread. They saw men pacing the ground with rods, measuring distances. They saw earthworks begin to rise, trenches dug in neat lines like the furrows of a farmer's field, only these were not for crops, but for death. At night, campfires stretched across the horizon in such numbers that it seemed as though the earth itself had caught fire. The light reflected on the clouds, turning the sky red as if announcing the coming of judgment. The psychological impact was crushing. Soldiers who had held bravely during the weeks of preparation now felt the weight of numbers pressing down on them. How could 20,000 resist when confronted with such an ocean of humanity? Some whispered prayers, others gritted their teeth, a few stared blankly, lost in despair. Yet the commanders understood that fear, if unchecked, could destroy the defense before the first shot was fired. Count Salm and Roggendorf walked the battlements, speaking to men directly, urging calm, reminding them that walls and courage could hold against numbers. Whether the soldiers believed those words or not mattered less than the fact that they heard them, spoken with conviction in the face of terror. The Ottomans wasted no time stripping Vienna's suburbs of life and cover. Outlying villages, cottages, and farmsteads were torched, their wooden beams collapsing in waves of smoke and sparks. Orchards and vineyards were torn down, denying defenders both shelter and supplies. Even the churches outside the walls were pulled apart, their stones repurposed for Ottoman earthworks. By the time the fires died, nothing but blackened ruins surrounded Vienna. For the defenders on the walls, the sight was a cruel omen. They knew that everything they loved beyond the gates was already lost. When the first exchanges of fire began, the sound shook both earth and heart. Ottoman artillery, though weakened by the mud of the march, still roared with thunder. Cannonballs slammed into Vienna's walls, hurling stone fragments like shrapnel. Arquebuses cracked from trenches, their smoke curling into the cold air. The defenders responded in kind, firing from embrasures, loosing arrows, and hurling stones down upon the nearest attackers. The air filled with smoke, the acrid smell of powder, the cries of men struck down in the first clashes of what promised to be a brutal contest. Standing on the walls during those first days was an experience carved into memory. The ground trembled with every cannon blast. The sky seemed always veiled in smoke, pierced only by the streak of fire from a burning house or the glint of sunlight on steel. Men clutched their weapons, knowing that a moment's hesitation could mean death. Yet the most haunting part was the silence between volleys. In those heartbeats, when no gun fired and no stone fell, the defenders heard the faint murmur of the Ottoman camp, the distant beating of drums, the neigh of horses, the foreign voices of tens of thousands waiting for the next command. The walls themselves became both shield and prison. From atop them, the defenders looked out on the plain and saw the immensity of the force arrayed against them. Behind those same walls, civilians huddled in fear, their lives dependent on the courage of soldiers and the strength of stone. Mothers quieted children with whispered prayers. Merchants locked their shops, knowing gold would mean nothing if the city fell. Every man, woman, and child felt the weight of the siege settling over them like a suffocating cloak. For the Ottomans, this was the beginning of triumph. Their trenches crept closer with each passing day. Their artillery continued its relentless pounding, and their confidence remained unshaken. Suleiman himself surveyed the walls from horseback, surrounded by attendants and guards, certain that time was on his side. Vienna had been encircled, the gates of destiny had closed. Rain came as though summoned by the prayers of the city. At first it was a drizzle, a fine mist that dampened cloaks and softened the earth. But within days it became a torrent, relentless, cold, and merciless. Sheets of water lashed across the Ottoman camp, turning tents into sodden caves, trenches into rivers, and roads into swamps. The very ground seemed to rebel against Suleiman's will. For the first time since the march from Istanbul, the unstoppable war machine began to falter. The roads bore the brunt of this natural assault. Where once they had carried caravans of grain, powder, and cannon, they now dissolved into endless stretches of mud. Horses sank to their knees, oxen strained until their yokes snapped, and carts tipped sideways, swallowed by the mire. Men waded ankle-deep, then knee-deep, in brown muck that clung to every step. What had been a highway of conquest became an ocean of sludge. The army that had seemed like a tide of iron was reduced to a struggling mass, every mile costing precious energy and time. The heaviest toll fell on the great cannons. These colossal engines of destruction, masterpieces of Ottoman metallurgy, had been dragged across Hungary at unimaginable effort. Now they were betrayed by the earth itself. Wheels that once turned slowly now refused to move at all, mired in ruts as deep as graves. Soldiers lashed teams of animals to the gun carriages, shouting, cursing, whipping, but the mud would not yield. In the end, dozens of cannons, the very weapons meant to smash Vienna's walls, were abandoned. They lay half buried in the Hungarian countryside, monuments to the futility of human ambition before the will of nature. Without their heaviest artillery, the Ottomans lost their sharpest edge. Smaller guns remained, but the grand plan to batter Vienna into submission with overwhelming firepower had been crippled before the first shot was fired. The defenders on the walls, though battered by what fire did come, soon realized that the terrible bombardment they had feared would never fully arrive. Their fragile medieval fortifications were spared the worst by nothing more than rain and mud. Yet artillery was only one piece of the puzzle. The lifeblood of the Ottoman army, its supplies, was also choked by the storm. Grain sacks spoiled in the damp, meat rotted before it could be eaten, powder caked into useless lumps. The vast army, so magnificent in its assembly, now consumed itself like a fire with too little fuel. Each man who marched or dug required bread, and each horse pulling a cart required fodder. But with supply lines stretched thin and convoys bogged down in Hungary's sodden fields, the army's stomach began to empty. Hunger gnawed at the camp, turning strength into weakness. Disease soon followed. Where tens of thousands lived shoulder to shoulder in wet, muddy quarters, sickness spread like wildfire. Dysentery thinned the ranks, men struck down by fevers and endless exhaustion. Typhus crept through the tents, carried by lice and filth, claiming soldiers faster than the defenders' bullets. The once proud host of Suleiman, which had marched west in splendor, now resembled a shivering mass of misery. Fires burned constantly in an effort to drive away the damp, but smoke only mingled with the stench of sickness. What Vienna could not do with cannon and musket, nature accomplished silently and relentlessly. From the walls, the defenders watched. At first they scarcely dared believe what they saw. The great Ottoman war camp, which had appeared like a vision of invincibility, was now marred by smoke from funeral pyres, by the sight of men dragging carts through mud like beasts, by the slump of soldiers too weak to lift their weapons. Scouts reported abandoned cannon, half-sunken wagons, and soldiers begging in villages for food. A strange reversal had taken place. The defenders, trapped and outnumbered, felt the first flicker of hope. Their enemy was bleeding, not from sword or shot, but from the sky itself. It was as though nature had chosen sides. Rain and mud became allies of the city, invisible battalions striking at Suleiman's army with unrelenting patience. The analogy was clear even to those who lived it. Nature was the ultimate general, its strategy slow but devastating. A cannon could be fired once, twice, 100 times, but the rain never ceased. A sword could strike down a single foe, but hunger felled thousands. The thought lingered, what if the weather had been different? Historians still ask the question. Had the autumn of 1529 been dry, the roads firm, the air clear, would Vienna have stood a chance? If the great guns had reached the walls intact, pounding them day after day, could the medieval defenses have survived? The speculation chills the imagination, for the difference between survival and annihilation was measured in raindrops. For the defenders, however, there was no time for speculation. Each day still brought cannon fire and raids, assaults and alarms. Yet behind the fear a subtle shift occurred. They no longer saw themselves as lambs before a wolf, but as men fighting alongside forces greater than themselves. The storm had leveled the field, not completely, but enough to inspire endurance. Where once they measured the enemy in endless numbers, now they counted themselves as part of a larger alliance, soldiers, walls, and weather. Within the Ottoman camp, frustration mounted. Suleiman himself, accustomed to bending nations to his will, now found his greatest adversary in the mud beneath his feet. His engineers cursed, his soldiers grumbled, his officers debated. Time, once his ally, now worked against him. Each day lost to rain was another day closer to winter. Another day his army weakened. Another day Vienna's defenders grew more confident. Yet retreat was unthinkable, and so the Sultan pressed on, driving his men forward into conditions that no general could control. As the days of misery lengthened, Vienna stood firm, its walls still scarred, its defenders still weary, but its spirit bolstered by the sight of an empire brought low by forces no sword could cut. The siege had entered a new phase, one in which men fought not only each other but the very elements themselves. The rain drummed endlessly on rooftops and armor alike, a rhythm of inevitability that drowned out hope for one side while lifting it for the other. The rains battered the Ottoman camp from above, but beneath the earth a quieter, deadlier struggle had already begun. Siege warfare in the 16th century was not fought only with cannons and cavalry. It was fought with shovels, pickaxes, and fire. Ottoman engineers, masters of the art, turned their attention to the hidden battlefield under Vienna's walls. If the city could not be broken from without, then it would be unmade from below. Sapping was as old as fortified warfare itself, but in the hands of Suleiman's engineers it became a science. Specialists began by driving shafts into the soil, propped with timbers, leading toward the base of Vienna's walls. Each tunnel was dug with painstaking precision, angled downward to prevent collapse, yet always inching closer to the foundations. The work was grueling. Men toiled in cramped darkness, their lungs filled with dust, their ears straining for the sound of enemy picks on the other side. By torchlight, they clawed through clay and stone, driven by the promise that when their mine reached its goal, the wall above would fall. The method was brutally simple. Once beneath a wall, sappers packed their chamber with combustible material, wood soaked in pitch, bundles of brush, barrels of oil. Fire was set, the supports consumed, and the chamber collapsed. In the violent rush of flame and falling earth, the stones above were shaken from their bed, leaving gaps that could be stormed by soldiers waiting outside. For the Ottomans, it was a tried-and-true tactic, tested in countless sieges across the empire. Vienna, they believed, would be no different. But within the city, the defenders understood the peril. Count Salm's commanders ordered countermines, shafts dug in desperate opposition. Viennese sappers, many drawn from local miners familiar with the soil of their homeland, descended into darkness to intercept the Ottoman tunnels. Theirs was a war fought without banners or trumpets, a contest measured in inches and heartbeats. In silence, they pressed their ears to the ground, listening for the muffled scrape of picks. When they heard it, they dug toward it, racing against time, hoping to break into the enemy's tunnel before it reached the wall. The encounters underground were terrifying. In the narrow confines of a mine, men stumbled into one another by torchlight, faces smeared with soot, weapons swinging in desperation. Pikes were useless in such spaces, so daggers and axes became the tools of sudden death. Sometimes the tunnels were deliberately set alight, both sides abandoning them as fire consumed the timbers and the earth collapsed, sealing all within. The war above ground was terrifying in its scale, but the war below was intimate, brutal, and suffocating. Archaeological evidence today has confirmed the extent of this subterranean struggle. Excavations around Vienna have uncovered collapsed shafts, charred timbers, and pockets of scorched earth, remnants of mines that once threatened to tear the city open. Each discovery tells of the unseen battle waged in darkness, where men fought not for glory, but for survival, unseen and unremembered except in the stones themselves. The tension for those within the city was unbearable. At any moment the ground beneath their feet could erupt. Mothers in their homes, soldiers on the ramparts, priests in their chapels, all lived with the knowledge that invisible enemies were gnawing at the city's foundations. Every rumble, every shudder of stone, every muffled boom sent waves of panic through the streets. It was not just death they feared, but sudden annihilation, the sense that the earth itself might betray them. Several times, explosions rocked Vienna. Great plumes of dust rose as portions of wall shifted and cracked. Stones tumbled into ditches, defenders thrown from the battlements in shock. Yet, miraculously, the walls held. Medieval masonry, though outdated against cannon, proved surprisingly resilient against mining. Repairs were made swiftly, rubble cleared, gaps braced with timber and earth. The defenders refused to yield, patching each scar as if stitching the body of the city back together. Still, each success carried the weight of what might have been. The knowledge that only feet of earth separated survival from collapse gnawed at morale. The siege above was visible, its threats tangible in the form of cannons and charging soldiers. The siege below was a phantom, invisible until the earth erupted. It was a duel of nerves as much as of skill, each side straining in the darkness for the upper hand. The cat-and-mouse game continued week after week. Ottomans dug, Viennese counter-dug. Some mines succeeded, others failed, but the pattern was constant: relentless pressure from below, desperate resistance from above. For the Ottomans, mining was a weapon of inevitability, a slow, patient method to crack open the shell of the city. For the Viennese, countermining was the last desperate gamble of men who knew that if even one tunnel succeeded, the walls might fall in an instant. The miners who fought these battles rarely saw the sunlight. They lived in the half-world of dirt and darkness, where each breath carried the taste of damp clay and smoke. Their victories were often invisible to those above, their deaths hidden in collapsed shafts that swallowed them whole. Yet without them, Vienna could not have stood. The defenders on the walls may have faced the visible fury of the Ottoman army, but beneath the ground, nameless men fought with equal courage against a quieter, deadlier foe. Above ground, soldiers and citizens learned to read the subtle signs of underground war. A sudden crack in the plaster of a house, a faint trembling in the earth, a low groan of timbers below. These were signals that the enemy was close. Priests blessed the miners before they descended, knowing they might never return. Children were hushed when strange sounds rose from beneath cellars, as though ghosts or demons prowled under the city. The siege became not only a test of arms, but of nerves, each man forced to live with the possibility that death might come not from the sky, but from the soil beneath his feet. Nature had already turned against Suleiman with rain and disease, but beneath the ground the battle belonged entirely to human ingenuity and endurance. It was a struggle where no general's command could dictate the outcome, only the sweat and courage of men clawing through the earth. Vienna's fate, in those days, rested as much in the hands of its miners as in the swords of its soldiers. The ground quaked, the walls trembled, yet Vienna endured. The struggle below was far from finished, but each day the city stood. It denied Suleiman the swift victory he sought. The siege was stretching, straining, becoming a test not of conquest, but of endurance. The thunder began before dawn, a sound that shook sleepers from their straw mats and sent dust drifting from rafters. From the Ottoman lines, the bombardment surged with renewed fury, hundreds of guns unleashing their voices together. The ground trembled beneath the city, stones shuddered in their mortar. The defenders on the walls clung to their positions as iron slammed into medieval masonry again and again, each impact a hammer blow driving home the reality that Vienna's walls, built for an earlier age, were never designed to face such fire. The old fortifications groaned like a ship in a storm. Sections bulged outward where the earthwork strained to absorb the punishment. Gaps opened in parapets, towers cracked, fragments of stone whirled through the air like shrapnel. Every strike was answered with the roar of dust and the cries of wounded men. Still the cannons fired, hour after hour, turning once proud defenses into broken teeth. For those standing watch, the question was no longer if the walls would fail, but when. Inside the Ottoman camp, preparations shifted. The Janissaries, Suleiman's elite, polished their weapons and straightened their armor. They were the pride of the empire, soldiers forged in discipline, bound by the conviction that death in service to the Sultan was the highest glory. On this day they were to prove themselves the hammer that would drive Vienna to its knees. In silence they readied their ladders, gathered their shields, and recited their prayers. Each man knew that survival was uncertain, but immortality awaited those who fell with courage. Vienna, too, prepared. Count Salm ordered every defender to his station, no matter his age or strength. The wounded were propped against the walls, bows or arquebuses thrust into their hands. Boys carried stones to the parapets. Women filled buckets with water to quench flames. Priests carried crosses along the battlements, whispering blessings as cannon thunder rattled the air. The city itself became a living organism, every inhabitant pulsing with the same determination: hold, no matter the cost. As the bombardment reached its crescendo, signals passed through the Ottoman ranks. Drums beat, horns blared, banners rose. From the dust and smoke surged the Janissaries, thousands moving with terrifying precision. Ladders clattered against walls. Grappling hooks whistled through the air. The Janissaries climbed with the practiced rhythm of men who had done this many times before, their chants rising to drown even the roar of cannon. The sky above Vienna seemed to darken as waves of men scaled its battered defenses. For the defenders, the assault was apocalyptic. Arrows and arquebus balls rained down from the parapets. Stones, boiling water, and even burning pitch were hurled on the climbers. Men struggled at the tops of ladders, shields banging, swords flashing, daggers thrusting in the chaos of close quarters. Some attackers reached the parapets, dragging themselves over with superhuman will. The fighting there was hand-to-hand, a brutal test of strength where every inch of wall was contested in screams and blood. Janissaries who gained the wall fought with fanatical resolve. Their curved blades slashed in tight arcs, their muskets fired at near point-blank range. They formed knots of resistance, pushing forward, trying to widen footholds into breaches. Yet every step was met with Viennese fury. Farmers turned soldiers, swung halberds with desperate strength. Nobles in armor stood shoulder to shoulder with peasants, all distinctions erased in the fire of necessity. The defenders fought not for plunder or glory, but for home, for family, for the knowledge that behind them lay everything they loved. The wall itself seemed alive, groaning, splintering under the weight of battle. Smoke curled from shattered stone, mingling with the cries of the dying. The clash of steel on steel rang so loud it drowned thought, reduced the world to instinct. Strike, block, push, endure. Every heartbeat was survival. More ladders rose, more janissaries climbed. For a moment, it seemed the tide would overwhelm the defenders. At several points, Ottoman banners flickered atop the parapets, their crescents visible above the smoke. Cheers rose from the attackers, despair from the city below. Yet Count Salm and his captains rushed reinforcements to each breach. Wherever a banner appeared, defenders hurled themselves forward, cutting down attackers, seizing ladders, throwing them back into the ditch below. The struggle was measured not in yards, but in feet, sometimes only in the width of a man's body. The defenders discovered the strange clarity of desperation. In the press of combat, exhaustion vanished, replaced by a single command from within: do not yield. Priests moved through the ranks, offering last rites to the fallen, urging the living to fight harder. Drums thundered on both sides, Ottoman rhythms matched by the cries of Vienna's bells, a cacophony of sound that wrapped the city in a cloak of chaos. Hours passed, though they felt like minutes stretched on blades. Corpses piled in the ditches, ladders broken, walls slick with blood. Again and again, the janissaries surged, their discipline unbroken, their courage unshaken. Again and again, the defenders hurled them back, though at terrible cost. Smoke stung the eyes, screams tore the throat, muscles ached beyond endurance. Still, the battle raged. By late afternoon, the assaults began to falter. Ottoman officers drove their men forward with whips and curses, but the cost was mounting. Each ladder toppled meant dozens of elite soldiers crushed or cut down. Each breach won was sealed in blood by the defenders' counterattack. Slowly, grudgingly, the tide receded. The janissaries withdrew, their drums calling them back from the walls, leaving behind the broken and the dead. On the ramparts, Vienna stood, but barely. Stones were cracked, parapets shattered. Defenders slumped in exhaustion, their armor dented, their faces smeared with soot and blood. They had endured the storm, but the memory of its fury lingered. The knowledge pressed on them that this was only the beginning. The enemy had tested the walls and the men upon them. More storms would follow. The morning began with a sound no defender could mistake, the grinding roar of stone giving way under relentless cannon fire. For weeks the walls had held, battered but stubborn. On October 12th at last they cracked. Dust rose in choking clouds as a great section of the fortifications collapsed inward, leaving a jagged maw in the city's armor. Through that breach lay Vienna's beating heart. Every man on the walls knew the truth. If the enemy poured through, the city was finished. From the Ottoman camp drums thundered, summoning the chosen. The janissaries advanced, their ranks dark and disciplined, banners snapping above them. They were not merely soldiers, they were the empire's blade, honed to perfection, schooled from childhood in obedience and war. They surged forward like a tide unleashed, ladders cast aside, eyes fixed on the breach. This was no skirmish. This was the moment designed to end the siege in one decisive stroke. Inside Vienna, Count Nicholas Graf Salm mounted the rubble with sword drawn, 70 years old yet unflinching. His voice carried over the chaos, calling men to stand with him. Pikemen massed in tight formation, bristling ranks like a living hedge of steel. Arquebusiers loaded as fast as their shaking hands allowed, sparks flashing as powder was primed. Every available man, wounded or hale, rallied to the breach. Behind them stood the city itself, its women, children, and elders, silent witnesses whose fate depended on those few hundred holding the line. The clash came sudden and violent. Janissaries hurled themselves into the gap, scimitars flashing, shields locking, their chants rising over the thunder of drums. The defenders answered with pikes, the two forces colliding in a storm of flesh and steel. The narrow breach became a cauldron where discipline and courage mattered more than numbers. Men fought face to face, eyes wild, blades scraping across helmets, pikes thrusting into armor, arquebus shots exploding at near point-blank range. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the iron stench of blood. Time lost meaning within the breach. Each heartbeat stretched into eternity. Defenders shoved ladders back, only to see new ones rise. Janissaries clambered over their fallen comrades, their zeal unbroken. For every attacker cut down, another pressed forward, relentless as the tide. The Viennese line bent, wavered, threatened to break. More than once, Ottoman banners appeared beyond the rubble, a flicker of terror for those within the city. Count Salm himself fought in the thick of it, his armor dented, his face smeared with soot. He stood as both commander and comrade, striking with his blade, rallying men when fear threatened to consume them. His presence steadied the line, his courage made endurance possible. Witnesses later swore that without Salm in the breach, Vienna would have been lost that day. Arquebusiers fired into the mass of janissaries, barrels so hot they scorched their hands. Smoke choked the breach, reducing vision to shadows and sparks. Pikemen thrust blindly into the press, their weapons catching cloth, bone, and armor alike. The clash became less a battle than a slaughterhouse, where men struggled not for victory but for survival one breath longer. By mid-afternoon, the ground itself was carpeted with bodies. Over 1,000 janissaries lay dead, their corpses piled so high that fresh attackers had to climb their fallen brothers to reach the fight. Still they came, as though Suleiman's will alone drove them forward. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, fought on with grim determination. Each push, each desperate volley held back disaster by the narrowest margin. Observers later noted that the breach itself, though wide, became a choke point. The very rubble that had threatened Vienna's fall now served as its salvation. The attackers could not deploy their full numbers. They were funneled into killing grounds where arquebus fire and disciplined pike walls had their maximum effect. Modern military historians argue this was decisive. The Janissaries' bravery was unmatched, but courage alone could not overcome physics and terrain. As dusk approached, the assaults faltered. Drums still pounded, but their rhythm no longer carried victory. Commanders whipped their men forward, yet the momentum was gone. The breach had not been taken. Exhausted and bloodied, the Janissaries staggered back, leaving their dead in heaps that filled the gap. Smoke hung thick, the cries of the wounded mingling with the toll of bells, as Vienna realized, almost with disbelief, that it had endured. For Suleiman, the cost was staggering. To lose over 1,000 of his finest soldiers in a single day was not merely a tactical setback, but a psychological shock. The Janissaries were the spearhead of his empire. Their failure to break through, even against a vastly outnumbered foe, struck at the heart of Ottoman confidence. Vienna, far from collapsing, had revealed a resilience that no cannon or elite corps could easily shatter. The defenders, though victorious, were scarcely less shaken. They stood amid the ruins of their own walls, weapons dripping, lungs burning, their city saved by the narrowest of margins. Many collapsed where they stood, too drained to celebrate. They knew what the cost had been, and they feared what the morrow would bring. As the sun set, the breach lay clogged with the bodies of the fallen, a grotesque monument to the day's fury. Fires smoldered in ruined houses nearby. The walls still trembled from bombardment. Yet for all the devastation, Vienna remained unbroken. The city had not fallen, not yet. The night after the great assault, silence fell heavier than the smoke that clung to the shattered ramparts. Both armies had bled, but the Ottomans had bled most. In the breach where thousands had perished, the stench of death lingered with such intensity that neither side dared approach too closely. For the defenders, that silence was filled with fragile relief. For Suleiman, it was the sound of opportunity slipping away. October had advanced with steady inevitability. Each dawn carried the promise of colder winds, shorter days, and harder nights. The autumn rains that had hounded the march now threatened to harden into something worse. Winter was not a distant shadow. It was already reaching across the Hungarian plain. To campaign so late in the season was to gamble against nature itself, and nature had been merciless thus far. In the Ottoman camp, morale frayed. Soldiers huddled in sodden tents, coughing from smoke, feverish with disease. Dysentery had already cut deep into the ranks, leaving latrines overflowing and supply trains fouled. Rations shrank by the day. What had once been a mighty war machine now felt like an organism consuming its own body, the lifeblood of the empire spent on a siege that stubbornly refused to yield. Commanders argued in low voices, balancing pride against reality. The siege had been planned as a swift blow, a thunderclap that would topple Vienna before resistance could harden. Instead, the city endured. Its walls still rose above the trenches, broken but not broken through. Its defenders, though gaunt and weary, still manned the battlements. Reports filtered back of their determination, that old men and wounded boys stood alongside pikemen, that priests shouted blessings as cannons roared, that every breach was met with fury. To an empire accustomed to easy conquest, such resilience was unsettling. Suleiman himself withdrew often into thought. He was no stranger to hard decisions, no stranger to risk. His campaigns had carried him across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, leaving a trail of victories that seemed unstoppable. Yet here, before Vienna, he found himself balanced on a knife's edge. To continue the siege meant more assaults, more dead janissaries, more weeks in the grip of worsening weather. To retreat meant the humiliation of acknowledging that the empire's might had been checked. Either path carried a cost he had not anticipated. Every evening intelligence couriers slipped between camps, their messages revealing the same truth in different tongues. Exhaustion was universal. The defenders, though holding strong, were nearly spent. Ammunition dwindled, food ran low, wounds festered. Men slept on their posts from sheer fatigue, their only comfort the knowledge that their suffering mirrored the enemy's. Both sides waited for the other to collapse first. The calendar weighed heavily on all minds. Campaign seasons in Europe were not indefinite. Once the weather turned, armies disintegrated. Roads became rivers of ice and mud, horses starved, men froze, wagons shattered. Suleiman's officers knew this well. To press the siege too far into October was to risk not merely defeat, but annihilation on the march home. Already, supply lines groaned, grain carts disappeared into the mud. Fodder for horses grew scarce. The mighty cannons that had seemed unstoppable now sank useless in the mire, left behind one by one. In his tent, Suleiman weighed reports with the calm of a man who understood both the stakes and the symbolism. Vienna was more than a city. It was the gateway to Central Europe, the prize that promised access to the heart of Christendom. To abandon it now was to halt that vision, perhaps forever. Yet each day of hesitation drained more strength from his army. The empire's most elite warriors had been fed into the breach and destroyed. The survivors looked to their sultan for salvation, not further sacrifice. What does victory cost? The question haunted the camp. The Ottomans could still launch another grand assault. The walls were cracked. The defenders were stretched thin, but the cost would be measured not only in men, but in prestige. If a second great attack failed as the first had, the blow to Ottoman pride might echo louder than retreat itself. On the ramparts of Vienna, Count Salm watched the enemy's hesitation with eyes sharpened by exhaustion. He saw the banners stir but not advance, the trenches fill but not overflow. Reports confirmed what he already sensed. The Ottomans were tiring, yet he dared not allow his men to grow complacent. Vienna had not won, it had merely endured. The defenders were as close to collapse as the besiegers, their bodies worn thin by hunger and fear. Still, he urged them to hold a little longer, whispering that winter was their ally. As October 15th approached, the balance tipped. Nights grew colder, winds sharper, fires harder to maintain. For Suleiman, the vision of triumph at Vienna now stood alongside the specter of losing the very army that had carried his banners across 3 continents. Pride urged him forward, reason whispered retreat. The Sultan's dilemma was not only military but personal, the choice between his legend as conqueror and his duty as ruler. On the morning of October 15, 1529, the decision came down from the Sultan's tent. The siege was over. Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Europe, had chosen withdrawal over annihilation. His commanders carried the order through the vast encampment, their voices heavy with a mixture of relief and shame. Vienna would not fall. The Ottoman host began to move, not with the thunder of conquest, but with the weary shuffle of retreat. Tents were struck, wagons loaded, banners rolled and stowed. The sprawling city of war that had consumed the plain outside Vienna dissolved into motion, its avenues of soldiers collapsing into muddy tracks, horses strained against wagons mired deep in sodden earth. The mighty siege guns, already crippled by the rains, were abandoned wholesale, left behind like monuments to ambition. The same machines that had shattered the walls of Constantinople now rusted useless in the Hungarian mire. For the soldiers, the retreat was no liberation. It was another campaign, one fought against hunger, exhaustion, and the cruelty of weather. Rain turned to sleet, nights lengthened, cold seeping into every joint. Men trudged barefoot after their shoes dissolved in the muck, their rations reduced to scraps unfit for animals. Corpses marked the path of the retreat, claimed by disease or exposure, and were left unburied in the haste of movement. Thousands perished before Hungary's fields even came into sight. The mighty Janissaries, pride of the empire, trudged with lowered heads. Their discipline held, but their silence told the truth of the campaign's cost. To these elite soldiers, survival without victory was a bitter draught. Behind them, columns of conscripts disintegrated into bands of stragglers, peasants pressed into service, now left to stagger homeward if they could. The war machine that had once seemed unstoppable was reduced to a trail of misery stretching across the Balkans. Within Vienna, the defenders climbed the battered walls and peered outward in disbelief. After weeks of thunder, silence, after nights lit by fire and explosions, only the glow of campfires dwindling into the distance, Some thought it a ruse, a feigned retreat before a final assault. Others, too tired to question, simply sank to their knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion. The city had not triumphed in glory, but endured in agony. Victory tasted of ash, but it was victory nonetheless. Count Nicholas Graf Salm, though worn by age and wounds, rode the lines with calm pride. He saw faces hollowed by hunger, uniforms in tatters, eyes glazed with fatigue. Yet these same men had stood against the greatest army in the world and lived to see it depart. Few cheers rose. The defenders were too spent. Instead, they leaned against walls blackened by fire, letting the reality of survival sink in slowly. Vienna still stood. The cost, however, was everywhere visible. Streets littered with rubble, churches scorched, homes shattered. The garrison had bled heavily, the population no less. Yet the city had not broken. The siege had consumed lives by the thousands, but in the memory of those who endured, the number mattered less than the fact that the city still breathed. For Suleiman, the retreat was more than a strategic necessity. It was a wound to prestige. His empire had never before faltered at such a scale. Constantinople had fallen, Belgrade had fallen, Rhodes had fallen. Everywhere the crescent had advanced, resistance had crumbled. Vienna was the first to resist and remained standing. The Sultan's reputation as an invincible conqueror bore its first true scar. In European courts, the news traveled faster than the retreating army. Messengers rode through rain and mud to carry word that the great city had withstood the Ottoman storm. Bells rang in distant cathedrals. Priests proclaimed it divine providence. Kings and princes who had watched in dread now exhaled in relief. The empire that had seemed poised to swallow Christendom whole had been checked. The tide had turned. Among the Habsburgs, Charles V saw the siege's end as a reprieve granted by fate. His fractured empire, beset by Protestant reformers and Mediterranean corsairs, had been spared from collapse. In Hungary, shattered nobles realized their kingdom was no longer a buffer, but a battlefield. For Vienna itself, survival was both triumph and warning. The city had faced the storm and survived, but it knew the tempest might one day return. As the Ottoman columns wound back across the Balkans, winter claimed its toll. Frostbite took hands and feet. Horses collapsed under loads too heavy for their wasted bodies. Supply depots meant to sustain the retreat proved empty or looted. The march became a culling, the empire's strength devoured by the very land it sought to dominate. By the time the survivors staggered into the relative safety of Hungary, the army had been stripped of much of its glory. Those who lived would remember Vienna not as a conquest, but as a graveyard of ambition. For the first time, the empire's expansion into Europe had met its limit. The road to Central Europe was closed, not by walls alone, but by weather, endurance, and the stubborn will of a city that refused to bow. In Vienna, as snow began to dust the ruined battlements, defenders gathered around dwindling fires. Their bodies were broken, their numbers thinned, but their spirits carried a truth the world would echo. The Ottomans could be resisted. The siege of 1529 would not be the last confrontation, but it had rewritten the map of possibility. The smoke of the Great Withdrawal had barely faded before Europe began to ask the inevitable question, would Suleiman return? Few in Vienna believed that the Sultan would accept the humiliation of 1529 as permanent. They were correct. Only 3 years later, in 1532, the shadow of the Crescent once again stretched across Central Europe, promising a reckoning that never came. Suleiman's court announced the new campaign with the same thunder as before. The empire, they claimed, had not been defeated at Vienna but delayed. The failure of 1529 could be avenged. The road into Europe reopened. Once more, armies were levied from the breadth of the empire. Anatolian cavalry, Arab auxiliaries, Janissaries from Istanbul, Balkan conscripts. Each element answered the call. Chroniclers report numbers to rival the earlier host, a force that again looked less like an army and more like a moving nation. Yet the march carried a different tone this time. In 1529, the empire advanced with unstoppable momentum, banners raised high, cannons rolling in confidence. In 1532, the same columns carried memories of mud, starvation, and bitter retreat. The soldiers knew Vienna was no longer an untested fortress. The campaign had already scarred them once, and the scars lingered. Within Vienna, the mood had shifted as well. The city that had survived now prepared with the knowledge of what survival cost. Count Nicholas Graf Salm, though mortally weakened by injuries sustained during the first siege, had left a legacy of preparedness. Engineers expanded the fortifications, rebuilding medieval walls with bastions better suited to withstand artillery. Ditches were deepened, earthworks raised, gun platforms reinforced. Archaeological studies reveal evidence of these enhancements: trenches filled, stone bastions reshaped, clear signs of a city learning from its brush with annihilation. This transformation altered the psychology of both sides. To the Ottomans, Vienna was no longer simply another fortress in the path of empire, but a symbol of resistance itself, a place where the myth of invincibility had cracked. To the Habsburgs, Vienna became more than a capital. It became the fortress of Christendom, the bulwark upon which the fate of Europe rested. The city's survival emboldened its defenders, drawing volunteers from across German lands. For the first time in generations, the balance of confidence began to tilt westward. Suleiman marched regardless. His prestige demanded another attempt. His empire expected it, and his rivals needed to be reminded of Ottoman reach. In the summer of 1532, the imperial host advanced through the Balkans again, its banners flickering in heat rather than rain. But something remarkable occurred. Vienna did not tremble. Instead, Vienna waited behind its new walls, calm and prepared. The memory of 1529 had hardened the city, transforming fear into determination. As the army drew closer, nature once again conspired against the Ottomans, though not with the same torrential violence. Rain slowed progress, harvest shortages strained supply lines, and the sheer scale of logistics threatened to repeat the disaster of 3 years earlier. Suleiman had not forgotten the mud of Hungary, nor the corpses left behind in the snows. He knew that Vienna's walls had grown stronger, its garrison larger, its spirit unbroken. In an extraordinary shift, the Sultan chose not to commit to another siege. His forces raided into Austria, clashing with Habsburg troops in skirmishes, testing defenses, burning villages, but the great confrontation never materialized. Chroniclers describe an army that seemed to circle its objective, yet never dare to strike. Vienna's gates never closed against bombardment. Its people never endured another underground war of mines and countermines. Instead, they watched as the greatest army in the world turned away. For Suleiman, this was not a concession made lightly. His empire remained vast, his armies formidable, but he recognized that to hammer against Vienna again was to risk a second humiliation. The campaign ended without glory, its thunder dissolving into frustrated withdrawal. Vienna had been challenged twice, and twice it stood. The psychological consequences echoed louder than the cannons ever had. Across Europe, rulers who had trembled at Suleiman's name now saw that he could be checked. Vienna became legend, not merely as a city that survived a siege, but as the city that could not be taken. The defenders of 1529 were immortalized in story, their resilience now reinforced by the silence of 1532. Even without a battle, the failure to engage was itself a kind of victory. Among the Habsburgs, confidence blossomed. Charles V, still beset by Protestant rebellion and Mediterranean raids, could now wield Vienna's survival as proof that his dynasty was shielded by divine favor. Recruitment for imperial defense grew easier. Funding for fortifications flowed more freely. Soldiers who once dreaded Ottoman banners now believed they could resist them. The very psychology of Central Europe shifted, no longer passive but defensive with resolve. For the Ottomans, 1532 marked the beginning of a subtle decline. Though the empire would continue to expand in the east, to challenge in the Mediterranean, and to menace Hungary, the aura of inevitability had faded. Suleiman had proven mortal in strategy, not just in flesh. His decision not to strike Vienna a second time was pragmatic, but history remembers it as the moment where ambition met its limit. The army returned home with loot, prisoners, and stories of raiding, but without the crown jewel of conquest. The second march on Vienna closed not with triumph, but with silence. In Istanbul, the court cloaked the campaign in rhetoric, proclaiming deterrence and dominance. Yet the absence of victory spoke louder than proclamations. Vienna endured as more than a city. It became an idea, the bastion of resistance, the fortress where empire broke upon stone and spirit. The Ottomans would never again march so directly against it. The tide that had surged since 1453, sweeping Constantinople, Belgrade, Rhodes, and Buda, reached Vienna twice, and twice it ebbed away. Vienna's walls still bore the scars when the city began to breathe again. Stones blackened by fire remained cracked, bastions pitted by cannon still stood half-crumbled, but the people within had survived. Markets reopened in streets once littered with rubble, churches rang their bells once more, and the survivors carried themselves with the unspoken pride of those who had faced annihilation and lived. The immediate aftermath was not simply recovery, it was rebirth. Vienna thrived because it had endured, and its survival became the bedrock of a new identity. Strategically, the siege marked a permanent turning point. For nearly a century, Ottoman expansion had rolled like a relentless tide into Europe. Constantinople had fallen, Belgrade had fallen, Rhodes had fallen, Buda had fallen. Everywhere the crescent banner appeared, resistance seemed futile. But Vienna changed that trajectory. The Sultan's inability to break the city's defenses meant Central Europe would not fall under Ottoman dominion. The Danube frontier, once the empire's open road, hardened into a boundary. Though Ottoman forces would raid and skirmish across Hungary, the vision of Suleiman's banners flying in the heart of Europe was shattered. Vienna had drawn a line that the empire could not cross. The religious implications resonated even deeper. For Christian Europe, Vienna became the altar of survival. Priests from Spain to Poland hailed the endurance of the city as a miracle, divine intervention against the infidel. In cathedrals, sermons framed the siege as a test of faith, proof that heaven itself had preserved Christendom's heartland. Protestants and Catholics alike, though bitterly divided, found themselves briefly united in relief. The survival of Vienna allowed the Reformation to continue, the Counter-Reformation to rise, and the fractured Christian world to endure within Europe's borders. Had Vienna fallen, the religious and political map of Europe might have been irrevocably redrawn. Politically, the implications were equally profound. The Habsburg dynasty, stretched across Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, had appeared vulnerable before 1529. Charles V fought on too many fronts, against Protestants in Germany, against France, against pirates in the Mediterranean. Yet Vienna's survival gave the dynasty a mantle of legitimacy. The House of Habsburg could claim not only imperial titles, but the mantle of defenders of Christendom. In the years after the siege, their authority within the empire solidified. Princes who once doubted imperial protection now saw Vienna as proof that the dynasty could stand against the greatest power in the world. Culturally, Vienna's identity transformed. Once a provincial stronghold at the edge of empires, the city became legend. Chronicles, songs, and stories celebrated its resilience. To Germans, Austrians, and Hungarians alike, Vienna was no longer merely a capital but a symbol. It stood for resistance, endurance, and the possibility of defying the inevitable. Over the centuries, poets and painters returned to the image of the walls standing firm against the storm. The city's memory became Europe's memory, a shared myth of survival that transcended politics. The military world, too, took its lessons. The siege demonstrated the vulnerability of medieval walls to modern artillery. Though Vienna survived, it did so against all odds, and commanders across Europe recognized the need to modernize defenses. The Tres Italian style of fortification, low, angled bastions designed to deflect cannon fire, spread rapidly after 1529. Engineers studied Vienna's patched walls and resolved not to repeat the city's gamble. On the Ottoman side, the logistical disaster revealed the limits of empire. An army could be immense, its weapons fearsome, but without roads, supplies, and planning, size became a burden rather than a strength. The Ottoman war machine had shown both its brilliance and its fragility. The siege also carved its place within the broader Ottoman-Habsburg conflict. For centuries, the Danube frontier remained contested ground. Raids, counter-raids, and campaigns scarred Hungary, Croatia, and the Balkans. Yet after 1529, the wars took on a different character. The Ottomans could batter the frontier but not erase it. The Habsburgs, though often on the defensive, now held the symbolic high ground. Each clash after Vienna was measured against that moment when Suleiman's army had been turned away. The siege became the axis around which the struggle revolved. Long-term consequences unfolded across generations. Vienna's survival meant that Central Europe developed without the direct rule of Istanbul. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured as it was, retained its independence. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation shaped the continent. The 30 Years' War would erupt, and European states would expand overseas, all possible because the heart of the continent had not been consumed. Ottoman power would remain immense, but its focus shifted eastward and southward, into Persia and the Mediterranean, rather than deeper into Europe. The siege of 1529 redirected the flow of history. Modern scholars view the siege not as a simple clash of civilizations, but as a complex turning point. Archaeology has revealed details of the fortifications, the Ottoman trenches, even remnants of mines dug beneath the walls. Historians debate whether the weather or the defenders proved more decisive, whether Suleiman truly sought to conquer all of Europe or merely to pressure the Habsburgs. Yet consensus holds that the event was pivotal. Vienna's resistance symbolized the end of Ottoman expansion into the European heartland, even if border conflicts raged for centuries afterward. What fascinates modern historians most is the interplay of chance and preparation. Vienna's outdated walls should not have held, yet they did. Ottoman artillery should have broken the city, yet mud and rain stole their power. Disease and logistics proved as lethal as cannonballs. To some scholars, the siege illustrates the unpredictability of history, how empires can falter not from weakness but from circumstance. To others, it is a story of resilience, proof that human determination can hold against overwhelming odds. Both views converge in Vienna's battered walls, which still whisper of 1529. Vienna emerged from the ordeal transformed, no longer a city on the edge, but a fortress at the center. Its survival shaped the politics of Europe, the faith of nations, and the strategies of armies. The ripples of 1529 spread outward through centuries, influencing wars, alliances, and identities. The siege was not merely an episode, but a hinge upon which the story of Europe turned. The miracle of Vienna remains one of those improbable moments in history when numbers, logic, and sheer reality seem to bend beneath the weight of human will. 20,000 souls, soldiers, nobles, townsfolk, even children who carried water and stones, stood against an army 5 times their size. They faced janissaries renowned across continents, artillery designed to pulverize walls, and a sultan whose empire stretched across 3 continents. Yet the city did not fall. It is tempting to reduce this to statistics, but behind every number was a face, a heartbeat, a decision to resist when surrender would have been easier. What made the difference? Leadership played its part. Count Nicholas Graf Salm, too old for command in most eyes, became the living symbol of determination, limping along the walls, refusing to hide, his presence binding the garrison together. Wilhelm von Roggendorf marshaled the troops with pragmatism and grit. Yet leadership alone could not explain survival. Determination, the shared understanding that there was no retreat, no refuge, no future without defense, fueled the defenders. Fortune, too, intervened. Storms turned roads to rivers of mud. Ottoman cannons sank. Disease spread through the besiegers' camp. The blend of courage, command, and circumstance shaped an outcome that history almost never grants. In many ways, Vienna 1529 was the quintessential David versus Goliath. The metaphor fits not only in scale but in spirit. Just as the shepherd boy's sling felled a giant, so too did a battered medieval wall, a handful of arquebusiers, and a rain-soaked season break the advance of the mightiest empire of its day. Military history is filled with such moments: Thermopylae, Agincourt, Stalingrad, when smaller forces, driven by desperation or conviction, halted a seemingly unstoppable tide. Vienna belongs in that pantheon, a testament to how the improbable becomes possible when human resilience collides with overconfidence and fate. For modern audiences, the siege carries lessons that transcend battlefields. The defenders of Vienna teach us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. They remind us that impossible odds do not always dictate impossible outcomes. In a world where challenges, personal, social, global, often seem overwhelming, the story of 1529 whispers across time. Hold the wall however battered, and you may yet endure. Leadership matters, yes, but so does the collective resolve of ordinary people who refuse to yield. At its heart, the siege was about individuals bound together in collective struggle. Imagine the blacksmith who set aside his hammer to wield a pike, the baker who carried stones to the ramparts, the mother who calmed children as cannon fire shook the night. Heroism was not only in the commanders, but in countless unnamed acts of endurance. The chroniclers may have preserved the names of nobles, but the true story lies equally in the sweat, blood, and determination of those whose identities were lost to time, yet whose efforts built the miracle. Speculation has long tempted historians. What if Vienna had fallen? Had Suleiman entered the city, Central Europe might have opened like a floodgate. The Habsburg dynasty could have fractured. Protestant and Catholic lands alike might have fallen under Ottoman sway, and the religious and political map of Europe would have been redrawn. Rome, perhaps even the Atlantic powers, might have faced pressure from an empire stretching deeper into the continent. The world we know, its wars, its states, its cultures, would have unfolded differently. History often pivots on such fragile fulcrums, where a day or even an hour of resistance alters centuries. For strategists, Vienna remains a case study in the paradox of power. It illustrates the limits of overwhelming force when stretched beyond logistical capacity, the dangers of underestimating defenders, and the decisive role of environment. Armies win battles, but mud, hunger, and time can defeat empires. Vienna shows that no plan, however vast, survives unscathed against the combined resistance of men and nature. As we close this journey, I want to thank you for staying awake with me through this epic of endurance. This has been The Sleepless Wars, where history's longest nights are retold for those who refuse to let them fade into silence. If you found this story as riveting as I did, I'd be grateful if you subscribed, left a like, and shared your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps suggest another great siege, another impossible defense that deserves its sleepless retelling. Your support keeps these histories alive, and your curiosity keeps them burning bright. Next time we may look at Malta or Constantinople, or some forgotten fortress where the fate of nations hung by a thread. Until then, take with you the memory of Vienna, where 20,000 stood against 100,000 and proved that walls, faith, and sheer will can alter the course of civilizations. Sleep well tonight, knowing heroes once stood watch on Vienna's walls.